Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. On the night of October 28, 1972, an extraordinary event occurred on the small, isolated island of Isla de Lobos, located just off the Uruguayan coast where the River Plate meets the Atlantic Ocean. This encounter would become one of the most compelling and well-documented cases of close contact with unidentified flying objects and their occupants in South American ufology. Isla de Lobos, which translates to Island of the Fur Seals, is a remote outpost where these marine mammals roam freely. The island's most prominent feature is its lighthouse, a virtual navigational aid maintained by a small garrison of Uruguayan Navy personnel. On this fateful night, 5 men were stationed at the island's headquarters. Corporal Juan Fuentes Figueroa, our witness, 2 enlisted men, Jose Gomez and Hector Jimenez, a telegraph operator, Jose Lima, and the sub-officer in charge, Francisco Cascudo. The evening began routinely enough. After dinner, the men gathered around the table, engaging in casual conversation and card games. At approximately 10:10 p.m, it was time for Corporal Fuentes to perform his nightly duty of inspecting the electric generators located at the base of the lighthouse. The lighthouse, an imposing structure standing 66 metres tall, was the heart of the island's operations. It housed not only the electric generators Fuentes was tasked with inspecting, but also the telegraph office. A flat terrace sat atop the building, raised about 6 metres above the surrounding terrain, while the living quarters for the garrison were located just 45 metres away from the lighthouse complex. As Corporal Fuentes began his short walk towards the lighthouse, he noticed something unusual: lights on top of the terrace that shouldn't have been there. His initial thought was that it might be a car, which was completely impossible. This absurd notion prompted Fuentes to return to the living quarters and retrieve his pistol from his room, a decision that would later be analysed as characteristic of his personality. It should be noted that during this time, his fellow officers were located in the kitchen, and he did not encounter them en route to retrieve his weapon. Armed with his pistol, Fuentes ventured out again, walking towards the lighthouse. As he drew closer, he observed that the object emitted multiple colours of light: white, a yellowish hue, and a third he described as violet, as in the rainbow. These lights provided sufficient illumination for Fuentes to discern more details of the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. To his astonishment, Fuentes saw a figure standing next to the object, with a second figure in the process of descending from it. As he continued to approach, a third and taller figure began to emerge from the craft. It was at this moment that the first 2 entities became aware of Fuentes' presence. There appeared to be a brief, silent communication between them before all 3 figures turned to face the approaching Navy corporal. By this point, Fuentes had closed the distance to about 27 metres from the object, which remained perched atop the 6-metre-high terrace. The craft and its occupants were above him, and Fuentes, acting on instinct and training, began to raise his arm to aim his pistol. However, he would never complete this action. In a moment that would perplex both Fuentes and later investigators, the entities somehow prevented him from firing his weapon. Fuentes, a man of limited education, struggled to articulate exactly how this was accomplished. It wasn't telepathy in the traditional sense, but he experienced physical sensations, a vibration, and his hair standing on end. More than anything, he described it as a premonition, an overwhelming sense that shooting would be futile. Whatever the mechanism, Fuentes found himself paralyzed and confused, unable to pull the trigger. The encounter continued to unfold rapidly. The entities, apparently alarmed by Fuentes' presence, began to re-enter their craft. The tallest being went first, followed by the others. Although Fuentes couldn't see any steps or handrails, the movements of the figures were clearly visible against the craft's illuminated interior. Their motions mimicked those of individuals climbing a ladder and steadying themselves with handrails, leading Fuentes to believe that such structures were present but somehow invisible to him. Once all three entities were aboard, the door closed sideways. The craft then began to ascend vertically, emitting a humming sound as it rose to a height of approximately 45 metres, a distance Fuentes estimated by comparing it to the adjacent lighthouse tower. At this point, the object tilted and, in a display that seared itself into Fuentes' memory, expelled a blinding fireball from its underside. In the next instant, it vanished, shooting off towards the southeast at an incredible, silent speed. Shaken to his core, Corporal Fuentes returned to the living quarters. His colleagues immediately noticed his pale complexion and the fact that he was still clutching his pistol. When Fuentes declared that he had seen a flying saucer, he was met with scepticism from most of his peers. Only Sub-Officer Cascudo seemed to give any credence to his account. Frustrated by the disbelief of his equals and immediate superiors, Fuentes resolved to take his story public upon his return to Montevideo. However, before he could approach any news outlets, he was ordered to report to a high-ranking officer. This officer listened attentively to Fuentes' account before disappearing into an office where, curiously, 2 members of the American embassy were waiting. According to Fuentes, these individuals were identified as officers from the, quote, Spatial Affairs Service, though the exact nature of this organisation remains unclear. Their presence at the Naval Command offices was not unusual, Fuentes noted. After providing his report, Fuentes was left waiting in the corridor. Eventually, someone emerged from the office and presented him with a series of drawings, asking him to select the one that most closely resembled what he had witnessed. After making his selection, Fuentes was dismissed. Although he never spoke directly with the American officials, Fuentes overheard fragments of their conversation through the door. He gathered that they were particularly intrigued by the close proximity of his observation. This detail adds an intriguing layer to the incident, hinting at ongoing interest and possible involvement of foreign agencies in UFO-related matters, despite official denials of their existence. The entire encounter lasted approximately 1 minute, with Fuentes having a direct view of the object for about 15 seconds. The craft was well illuminated by its own lights, and, fortuitously, the external floodlights that usually illuminated the lighthouse complex were not operational that night. This circumstance allowed Fuentes an unobstructed view of the craft and its occupants, silhouetted against the object's internal lighting. Fuentes described the craft as an inverted bowl-shaped object measuring between 4 and 5 metres in diameter. It featured a dome on top and a rectangular aperture or door through which the entities entered and exited. The object was supported by legs, which Fuentes observed clearly during the initial stage of its departure. These legs didn't fold like aircraft landing gear, but instead retracted telescopically. The surface of the craft appeared metallic, with a reddish hue that Fuentes likened to mahogany. Perhaps the most distinctive feature was an antenna atop the craft, shaped like a corkscrew and rotating. The craft's lights, which Fuentes described as little squares, moved and flashed in a manner reminiscent of an advertising sign. As for the entities themselves, Fuentes reported that 2 were approximately 1.5 metres or about 5 feet tall, while the third and last to emerge was taller, standing between 1.75 and 1.8 metres, or around 6 feet tall. Their silhouettes appeared dark, as if they were wearing heavy black rubber suits. Fuentes attributed their slow, deliberate movements to the apparent weight of these garments. The most striking feature of the beings, clearly noticeable in profile, was the elongated shape of the backs of their heads. It remained unclear to Fuentes whether this was the natural shape of their craniums or the result of some form of hood or headgear. In the days and weeks following the incident, the case caught the attention of CIOVI, which translates as the Centre for the Investigation of Unidentified Flying Objects, a respected Uruguayan UFO research organisation. Their thorough investigation would elevate this single witness sighting to one of the best documented cases in Uruguayan ufology. The CIOVI team conducted 2 lengthy recorded interviews with Corporal Fuentes in his home. These sessions revealed no discrepancies in his narrative. Following these interviews, investigators organised an on-site reconstruction of the events with Fuentes' participation. Sub-Officer Cascudo, present on the island that night, confirmed that Fuentes' initial account matched the description he later provided to the investigating team. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the CIOVI investigation was their decision to enlist a professional psychologist to subject Fuentes to an extensive battery of psychological tests. These assessments, which included the Raven, Bender, Rorschach and PMK tests, spanned a total of 9 hours and provided fascinating insights into Fuentes' personality and credibility as a witness. The psychological evaluation described Fuentes as sincere, uncomplicated and simple, an individual who expresses what he believes to be the truth in a straightforward manner, unburdened by cultural or intellectual pretensions. Crucially, the tests indicated that Fuentes had no tendency to fabrication or fantasy, a key factor in assessing the veracity of his account. Moreover, the psychologist noted that Fuentes possessed less than average intellectual capacity and lacked an average imagination. While these traits might be considered disadvantageous in many contexts, they actually bolstered Fuentes' credibility as a witness to an extraordinary event. His limited knowledge of ufology and current events made it highly unlikely that he could have fabricated such a detailed and unusual story. From an emotional standpoint, Fuentes was characterised as, quote, insecure, prompt to react anxiously and even aggressively to unexpected situations. This assessment aligns perfectly with his initial reaction to the sighting, arming himself with a pistol when confronted with the impossible presence of an unknown object on the lighthouse terrace. The psychological profile further indicated that Fuentes had a balanced psychic personality and that it was unlikely that he would confabulate by himself unless an external event would upset him. This evaluation, combined with the observed physical effects of the encounter, such as his trembling voice and pale complexion reported by his colleagues, strongly suggested that Fuentes had indeed experienced a profound and disturbing event. The Isla de Lobos UFO encounter of October 28, 1972, stands as a remarkable case in the annals of ufology. The remote location, the credibility of the witness as established through rigorous psychological evaluation, and the detailed nature of the observation all contribute to its significance. While questions inevitably remain about the exact nature of what Corporal Juan Fuentes Figueroa experienced that night, the investigation by CIOVI and the subsequent analysis provide compelling evidence that something truly extraordinary occurred on this small and isolated Uruguayan island.